Imagine putting just a few drops of blood into a tiny device and getting hundreds of medical test results instantly. No needles, no labs, no waiting. It sounded like the future of healthcare. It looked like the future of healthcare, and for years, it made Elizabeth Holmes look like the future of Silicon Valley. There was only one problem. The technology didn't work. Theranos wasn't just a company. It was a performance, a carefully engineered story about innovation, disruption, and the kind of world-changing idea that investors in Silicon Valley love to believe they are funding. At the center of that story was Elizabeth Holmes. Young, brilliant, or at least brilliantly packaged, determined, and for a long time, nearly impossible to challenge. Theranos promised to revolutionize blood testing with a small device that could run hundreds of medical tests from a tiny sample of blood. If that sounds ambitious, it's because it was. If it sounds medically complicated, it is because it was. And if it sounds like something that should have been tested very carefully before becoming a $9 billion company, yes, exactly. But in Silicon Valley, a strong story can travel faster than the truth. In 2003, Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford University. She was 19 years old. That detail mattered, because in tech culture, dropping out isn't always seen as a warning sign. Sometimes, it's treated like destiny. The founder who left school early to chase a vision, the outsider who seized what everyone else missed, the next great disruptor. Holmes understood the mythology perfectly, so she stepped into it. She founded Theranos with a simple but explosive idea. Blood tests were outdated, inconvenient, too dependent on large, centralized labs. Her solution was elegant on paper. Use a tiny device, use only a few drops of blood, make testing faster, cheaper, and more accessible. It sounded like the kind of innovation that gets applause in a pitch meeting and a $1 billion valuation in the same afternoon. Holmes also understood something else very important. In Silicon Valley, image matters. So she built one. Black turtlenecks, a controlled posture, a serious expression, a deep voice that made every sentence sound like it had been approved by a board of directors. The comparisons to Steve Jobs came very quickly. Maybe too quickly. But Holmes leaned into them, because to be fair, it did work. She looked like someone who had already won the future, and when people see confidence dressed up as certainty, they often stop asking for evidence. That is one of the oldest tricks in business. It's also one of the most expensive. Investors poured money into Theranos. A lot of money. More than $700 million over time. A peak valuation of $9 billion. And all of it built around a product that was supposed to transform medicine forever. Holmes became the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world. She was celebrated by the media, adored by powerful people, and treated like proof that the future belonged to bold founders with big visions and even bigger ambition. Theranos also assembled a board that looked impressive enough to make almost anyone stop asking questions. Former secretaries of state, military leaders, powerful figures with serious reputations. What it didn't have was a strong foundation of scientific validation, which, in a blood testing company, is a small detail with only one important. The most important importance. Inside Theranos, the reality was much less glamorous. Engineers struggled, the machines failed, results were inconsistent, tests didn't work as claimed, and the gap between the public story and the internal reality kept getting wider. Some employees realized the technology wasn't ready. Others feared it might never be ready. But Theranos operated with extreme secrecy, and that made the truth harder to surface. Teams were isolated, information was tightly controlled, people who raised concerns were often ignored, sidelined, or pushed out. That is the strange thing about secrecy in a company like this. It's supposed to protect the mission. Instead, it often protects the lie. Outside the company, the story kept getting better. Theranos looked polished. It sounded visionary. It had the kind of language investors love, and the confidence that makes journalists write flattering headlines before the hard questions arrive. The company began forming partnerships with major names, including Walgreens. Theranos planned to install testing centers inside retail pharmacies across the United States, making blood testing as easy as buying toothpaste. That sounds efficient. It also sounds like the sort of thing that should only happen after the technology has been thoroughly proven. But that is not how the story unfolded. That is the danger of a good pitch. Once the story becomes large enough, people start assuming the facts must be keeping up. As Theranos expanded, the risks stopped being theoretical. This wasn't just a startup missing deadlines. This was a healthcare company dealing with unreliable tests. And when medical results are wrong, the consequences are not just financial. They're human. Patients could receive incorrect information, doctors could make decisions based on flawed data, and all the while, the public image of the company remained glossy and disciplined. It is a deeply modern kind of disaster. The branding is excellent, the metrics are terrible, and everyone is smiling for the camera. In 2015, journalist John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal began investigating Theranos. This is the moment the story starts to break. Carreyrou spoke to former employees. He looked at the technology, he asked questions the company had spent years avoiding. And what he found was devastating. The technology did not work as advertised. The test results were unreliable. The company had misled investors, partners, and the public. In other words, Theranos hadn't built the future of medicine. It had built a very expensive illusion around the idea of the future. Regulators stepped in. Theranos was forced to avoid thousands of blood test results. Walgreens shut down its Theranos testing centers, partnerships dissolved, investors panicked. And the company that had once been worth $9 billion began to fall apart. The speed of the collapse was almost as striking as the rise. One moment, Theranos was being presented as the future of healthcare. The next, it was a case study in how hype can outrun reality for years. Elizabeth Holmes remained at the center of the storm. For years, she had carefully built herself into a symbol of visionary leadership. She controlled the narrative, she maintained the image, she spoke with enough authority that many people stopped looking for proof. That is the part of the story that makes people uncomfortable, because it's not just about deception, it's about how many smart people wanted the deception to be true. Theranos offered them the perfect combination: a huge market, a charismatic founder, and a message that sounded morally and financially irresistible. Who wouldn't want to believe that? In 2018, Holmes was charged with fraud. The accusations were serious. She was accused of misleading investors, patients, and business partners about what Theranos can actually do. The trial exposed internal communications, employee testimony, and a long list of contradictions between the company's public claims and its private reality. One of the most striking parts of the case was how ordinary the fraud looked from the inside. There was no movie-style villain speech, no dramatic confession, no lightning bolt moment where everyone in the room suddenly realized what had happened. Just years of pressure, denial, and carefully managed ambiguity. That is often how big scandals survive for so long, not because they're invisible, but because they're packaged well enough to postpone disbelief. In January 2022, Holmes was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud. In November 2022, she was sentenced to more than 11 years in prison. The woman who had been celebrated as a world-changing founder had become the face of one of the most dramatic collapses in Silicon Valley history. Not exactly the career path the press releases were preparing for. The Theranos story is bigger than one company. It's a lesson about business culture, media hype, investor psychology, and the danger of confusing confidence with competence. Silicon Valley loves bold vision. It rewards founders who move fast, dream big, and speak in the language of disruption. But when the vision becomes more important than the evidence, the entire system becomes vulnerable. Science does not care about branding, medicine does not care about charisma, and reality, inconvenient as always, does not care about how good the pitch deck looks. Theranos becomes a warning, a reminder that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, a reminder that a good story can hide bad facts, for longer than most people imagine, and a reminder that the future is not something you announce, It is something you build. Carefully, test by test, blood sample by blood sample. Theranos promised to revolutionize healthcare. Instead, it became one of the biggest startup scandals in modern business history. A company built on ambition, a founder built on image, and a $9 billion valuation built on a machine that didn't work. That is the danger of believing the story before checking the facts. Because sometimes the most impressive thing a startup can do is not innovate. Sometimes it is convince the world to look away while the truth quietly falls apart. And that, in the end, is the story of Theranos, the $9 billion lie. If this story made you think, be sure to drop a comment down below. What would you have done differently? As an investor, as an employee, as a regulator? And if you want more stories about the moments when ambition crosses the line, you already know where to subscribe.